German Shepherd freezes with two pups. The man's decision to open the door will shock you. The wind howled outside like a wounded creature, each gust slamming against the wooden walls of Jack Carter's cabin with a fury that felt personal. Snow clung to the windows in thick, icy sheets, turning everything beyond the glass into a swirling blur of white chaos. Inside, the fireplace crackled, casting long, flickering shadows against the log-lined walls. Jack sat in his worn armchair, a thick flannel blanket over his lap, a mug of black coffee in hand, watching the fire the way one watches old memories with both comfort and pain. The smell of wood smoke clung to his sweater, to the books lining the shelf, to the very air of the cabin that had become more a fortress than a home these past years. Since Ember, Jack hadn't spoken her name aloud in a long time. Ember had been more than a dog. She was a partner, a fellow rescuer, a soul with purpose. When that building collapsed during the fire 5 years ago, and she went back in for the child, Jack never expected the flames would claim her instead. They pulled the boy out, alive, but not Ember. Jack had stopped living out loud after that, retired early, bought the cabin, moved into the snow in silence. It was easier to be alone with ghosts than risk making room for anything living. That night, the storm was expected to last through morning. Jack had locked the doors early, secured the windows, stacked extra logs near the fire. Routine. The weather didn't scare him, nothing much did anymore. What he didn't expect, what truly unsettled him, was the sound. Not the wind or the creaking of old timbers. No, this was soft, repetitive, delicate, scratching. At the door, Jack stiffened, set his mug down slowly, listened. It came again, faint but insistent. Scratch, pause, scratch. He stood, the blanket falling from his lap, heart suddenly alert in a way it hadn't been in years. Approaching the door, he felt foolish, a branch maybe, a bird gone mad in the storm. But when he pulled back the curtain and peered through the frosted glass, what he saw froze him more than the wind ever could. A German shepherd, emaciated and trembling. Huddled against the door, her head low, eyes half closed. Underneath her curled two tiny shapes, puppies, barely alive, their fur matted with ice, their bodies nestled beneath her chest like fading embers of heat. Jack didn't move. His hand gripped the doorknob, but didn't turn it. The vision before him was too much like something he'd buried. Ember had been a shepherd too, strong, proud, unbreakable. This dog was broken. This scene was a mirror of helplessness. And Jack didn't know if he had it in him to open the door. But then the mother dog lifted her head. Their eyes met through the glass, hers clouded with fatigue, but fierce with will, not begging, not pleading, just existing, defying the storm. And something broke open in Jack's chest. He unlatched the door and pulled it open. The wind nearly knocked him back, sending a flurry of snow inside. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. Jack knelt slowly, extending a hand. "Come on, girl," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Let's get you out of this hell." The shepherd glanced behind her, nudged the pups gently, then staggered forward, almost collapsing into Jack's arms. He guided them all inside, shutting the door against the storm. The heat of the fireplace seemed too sharp, too sudden for their frozen forms. Jack laid down blankets near the hearth, fetched towels, warmed broth, did everything his memory recalled from years ago. The mother dog let him help. That surprised him. He'd expected growls, maybe a nip, but she just looked at him with those unreadable eyes and shivered. The puppies barely stirred. Jack gently lifted them one by one, placing them beside their mother. One was slightly larger, with soft white fur he'd call that one Snow. The other, smaller, with a limp in its hind leg and trembling more violently, reminded him of the slender hickory trees that clung to life in the wind. Hickory, that one would need care, extra care. He stayed with them all night, dozing in the armchair, waking every hour to check the puppy's breathing, to replenish water, to speak soft words into fur still damp with melted ice. The storm raged on outside, but inside something had shifted by morning. The cabin smelled of wet dog and smoke and something else, something warmer. Life. The mother dog began to trust him over the next few days. She ate from his hand, let him clean her wounds, even let him brush the thick mats from her fur. He named her Grace, not because she was elegant, far from it, but because of the strength she carried through suffering. There was a quiet nobility in her, the kind that doesn't come from breeding, but from survival. Jack took Grace and the pups to the local vet, a young woman named Dr. Kaminsky, who didn't ask too many questions. She confirmed what Jack already suspected: the puppies were underweight, weak, especially Hickory with his injured leg. But they had a chance, a good chance with care, food, and warmth. They could make it. Jack committed to that care without hesitation. He built a small pen inside the cabin for the pups, spent hours helping Hickory move, massaging the tiny leg, using techniques he remembered from Ember's injury once, years ago. He spoke to them as if they were people, something he hadn't done in ages. Sometimes he'd catch himself laughing at Snow's antics, at Grace's deep sighs as she lay by the fire, at Hickory's stubborn attempts to stand when logic said he shouldn't. Nights passed quietly. The storm faded. The cabin became less a fortress and more a nursery. Jack didn't even realize how much he'd changed until the day he caught himself humming while chopping vegetables. That hadn't happened since Ember. One evening, as Grace slept near the fire and the puppies snored in a pile of blankets, Jack stood by the door and looked out at the snow-covered world. It was quiet now, peaceful. The kind of quiet that invites reflection instead of avoidance. He whispered into the stillness, "I didn't save you, did I?" behind him. Grace stirred but didn't rise. Jack turned back to the fire and, without thinking, picked up a notepad from the kitchen counter. He scribbled something, just a line, but it said everything. "I opened the door thinking I was saving them. But the truth is, they saved me from a loneliness I didn't know how to name." He didn't post it yet. That would come later. For now, it stayed on the page, sitting beside a bowl of water, a cracked food dish, and three sleeping creatures who had wandered into a man's grief and melted it from the inside out. And outside, the snow kept falling. But inside that cabin, something had finally thawed. The days that followed blended together in a rhythm Jack hadn't known he craved. The morning fire crackled before the sun even touched the frost-bitten windows. The kettle hissed on the stove, and Grace stirred from her corner near the hearth only when she sensed Jack's presence behind her. Snow, ever energetic, was always the first to tumble into movement, yipping as she explored every inch of the cabin as though each morning was a new world. But Hickory remained quiet, pressed tightly into the blanket nest Jack had made, his back legs curled unnaturally, his eyes watching the others but not moving to join them. Jack noticed it early on, the way Hickory struggled even to sit up, the tremble in his body, the way he cried softly when pressure touched his hindquarters. The vet had said the leg might never develop properly, that a pup born in cold, half-frozen air might carry the memory of that cruel beginning in his bones forever. But Jack had seen broken bodies before. He had pulled people from rubble, treated burns with his own hands, held soldiers while they bled, and he had seen Ember limp for weeks after an injury in the field, only to sprint months later like nothing had happened. He wasn't going to give up on Hickory. He couldn't, in some stubborn, quiet way. That pup had become his focus, his reason to move, to try, to care. He built a small support sling from an old flannel shirt, sewing it carefully, slipping it under Hickory's middle like a harness, holding him upright while gently encouraging movement. The first few times, Hickory whined, his legs collapsing immediately. But Jack, patient and soft-voiced, tried again the next day, and the next. Grace watched silently from her resting spot, eyes alert, body still. She never interfered. But when Jack brought Hickory back to the blanket after each session, she licked the pup's face and curled herself around him as if her warmth could make up for everything the world had taken. Jack didn't say it aloud, but something in that mother dog's gaze made him feel seen, understood, as though they both knew what it was like to have something broken inside and keep walking anyway. Snow, of course, remained oblivious to the heaviness, which Jack appreciated more than he admitted. The little pup barked at firewood, pounced on socks, chased imaginary birds across the floor. She often tried to pull Hickory into play, confused when her brother didn't respond. Once, she gently dropped a stuffed fox toy beside him and nudged it closer with her nose. Hickory sniffed it, sighed, and fell asleep. Jack had lived years without speaking more than a few polite words to strangers in town, avoiding neighbors, grocery clerks, and any spark of connection. Now he found himself murmuring constantly to the dogs, to the fire, even to himself. "You're getting stronger, buddy," he said one morning, brushing snow from his boots after bringing in logs. Hickory, propped up in the sling, wobbled but didn't collapse. His legs twitched. Jack nearly laughed. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what we call progress." And it was, week by week. Hickory moved a little more. First, the trembles stopped. Then he began to push his front paws against the floor. One day, he managed to take 2 wobbly steps before falling sideways into the blanket pile. Jack clapped his hands like a proud father, lifting him gently back into the sling, with praise tumbling out faster than he could think. And though Hickory didn't smile, dogs don't. Not really. His eyes shone with something brighter than before. But the cabin wasn't just filled with therapy and quiet progress. There were still shadows, sometimes at night. Jack would wake up in the chair beside the fire, heart pounding, breath sharp. He'd dream of smoke, of Ember's bark disappearing behind a flaming door, of radios crackling with bad news. He'd sit there in the dim glow, trying to shake the memory, until a soft nudge came at his leg. Always Grace, she would stand there in the dark, watching him silently, and then lie down beside his chair, pressing her body against his foot. She never barked, never demanded, just existed beside him like a steady heartbeat. One morning, as snow piled high against the windows and the wind screamed through the trees, Jack decided to try something he hadn't done in years. He went out back to the old shed and pulled down the cardboard box labeled Ember. Inside were things he'd locked away, with his grief a red harness, a training whistle, a faded photograph of them both in uniform. Jack sat there in the cold shed, surrounded by silence and snow, holding the harness in his calloused hands. He didn't cry. He didn't have to. The tears had been cried long ago. But when he walked back inside and found Hickory standing, not sitting for the very first time, he felt something thaw, slowly, quietly, like winter giving way. The next day, he introduced them to the field. The storm had passed, leaving behind crisp air and fresh powder. Jack bundled up and carried Hickory outside, snow leaping ahead, Grace walking beside him like a sentinel. At the edge of the clearing, he set Hickory down gently in the snow. The pup wobbled, sank a little, but didn't fall. Jack stood a few feet away and opened his arms. "Come on, Hick," he said softly, "come to me." And Hickory moved. One step, then another. Then he stumbled and face planted. Jack knelt, heart tight, unsure whether to help or let him try again. Hickory struggled, pushed with his front legs, and rose again. This time, 3 steps. Jack let out a laugh that startled even himself, echoed by a playful bark from snow. Grace stood still, watching it all, her ears forward. It wasn't just about legs, it was about trying, about rising again, even if you fell. That night, Jack made stew, sharing bits of carrot with the pups, letting Grace lick the spoon. He turned on the old radio for the first time in ages, letting the hum of distant voices fill the room. When the fire burned low, and the dogs curled up close, Jack reached for the notebook on the side table. He flipped past the page where he'd written about saving them and being saved in return. This time, he wrote, "Progress isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a puppy taking 3 shaky steps in the snow, and a man remembering how to breathe again." Then he set the notebook down, leaned back, and let the silence of the cabin hold him not as a prison, but as a shelter outside. The snow continued to fall softly, but inside, warmth bloomed. Not from the fire alone, but from life stirring again imperfect, healing, stubborn, and real. Hickory slept near his feet, snow snoring softly beside the hearth, and Grace, as always, keeping watch from the shadows, her eyes the color of something ancient and kind. Jack closed his eyes and finally let the quiet in, not as something to fear, but something earned. The morning was unusually still, No wind rattled the windows, no snow fell. The world outside the cabin seemed frozen in pause, as if nature itself held its breath. Inside, Jack was bent over a basin of warm water, gently washing Grace with a damp cloth. She had tolerated this new routine with surprising patience, standing still while he worked through the tangles of her fur. Snow had already darted through the living room with a stolen mitten in her mouth, while Hickory attempted to drag himself across the rug with more determination than Grace. Jack chuckled softly, the sound feeling foreign in his own throat but not unwelcome. As he parted Grace's fur along her neck, his fingers paused. There, nestled beneath layers of matting, was something cold and metallic. Gently, he worked it free, an old, frayed collar, cracked and stained with time. The tag attached to it was barely legible, but with a bit of rubbing and the help of the morning light, he could just make out the faded inscription, "To my brave girl, 406-774-2189. Jack stared at the numbers for a long while, heart unexpectedly pounding. This wasn't just some abandoned stray. Grace had belonged to someone who had loved her enough to leave a message like that. His first instinct was hesitation. He didn't want to lose her, not now, not when they had all just begun to feel like something real. But Jack had always lived by a code, even in retirement, even in solitude, even in grief. Doing what was right mattered. With a sigh that felt heavier than it should, he reached for the phone. He hadn't used it for anything but vet calls and supply orders in months, punching in the number slowly. He waited. 3 rings, 4, then a click, and a frail voice answered. "Hello," Jack cleared his throat. Uh, Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. I found a dog, a German Shepherd. She had a collar with this number. Says, 'To my brave girl.'" There was a silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind that fills a space with something unseen, like a sharp inhale. Then the voice trembled. You have her." Jack hesitated. "Her name's Grace," he offered gently. A sob cracked through the line, followed by a shaky laugh. "Grace? Oh my God, I thought she was dead." The woman's name was Eleanor. She sounded like she'd aged a lifetime since Grace had last seen her. She explained, through broken phrases and tears, that Grace had been a therapy dog, trained, loyal, fiercely empathetic. After her husband died, Eleanor said, she fell into a darkness she didn't think she'd crawl out of. But Grace, she just rested her head on my chest when I cried. She never left my side. She saved me. Jack sat down, the phone cradled against his ear, his eyes resting on Grace, who now lay curled on the rug, her ears twitching slightly at the sound of his voice. Eleanor told him Grace went missing during a transfer between facilities. A winter storm hit. The van skidded off the road, and in the chaos, Grace disappeared. That had been almost 4 months ago. They searched, posted flyers, called shelters. Nothing. She had mourned her like family. And now, hearing that Grace was alive, safe, and cared for, it was more than she dared hope. "Would you like her back?" Jack asked quietly, dreading the answer. Another pause, then Eleanor said, No, I couldn't do that to her. If she stayed with you, if she found her way to your door in a storm, then maybe she was meant to be with you now. Just tell her I'm so glad she made it." When the call ended, Jack sat in a silence for a long time. He looked at Grace again. She had lifted her head now, watching him with those amber eyes that held storms and softness all at once. Jack reached down, ran a hand along her back. "You've saved more than one person in your time, haven't you?" She licked his hand once, then rested her head against his boot. That night, after the pups were fed and the fire had died down to coals, Jack took the old collar and placed it on the mantel beside Ember's harness. It felt right, placing the two together not as comparisons, but as chapters of a life finally unfolding again. He picked up his journal, the same one where he'd written about being saved by the lives he thought he was saving. He turned to a new page. Grace had a life before me, a purpose. She still does. She's not just healing. She's helping me remember who I was before the silence. The next morning, Jack went into town. It was the first time he'd driven in over 2 months. The general store owner blinked at him as though seeing a ghost. Jack just smiled and asked for a new dog collar, brown leather. Sturdy, simple. He brought it home, fit it gently around Grace's neck, and engraved a new tag: found, loved, home. As the snow outside began to melt just a little around the edges, revealing patches of stubborn earth beneath, Jack noticed something else too. Hickory had started dragging himself toward the front door each morning. Bueno. Not far, not fast, but always in the same direction, toward the light, toward the outside world, toward possibility, and for Jack. That movement was more than enough. That evening, Grace lay on the porch for the first time, watching the horizon with the calm stillness of someone who has seen sorrow and chosen to stay anyway. Snow dozed beside her, twitching in a dream, and Hickory rested between Jack's boots, head tilted upward as if taking in the stars. Jack looked down at the pup, then back at the trees beyond. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. Inside, the old photo of Ember still hung beside the fire, but now, beside it, there was a new picture: Grace with her head tilted, Snow mid-leap in a blur of energy, and Hickory gazing solemnly at the lens with quiet strength. And beneath it, Jack had written one simple line: some journeys end at your front door. Some begin when you choose to open it. Jack had always trusted his footing in the woods. Years of navigating unstable ground, slipping through rubble, and dodging danger as a firefighter had left his instincts sharp and his steps certain. Even here, in his 60s, the paths behind the cabin still felt familiar underfoot, even when snow blanketed the ground. The forest was quiet this morning, the sun finally daring to pierce through weeks of storm-gray skies, casting long shafts of light across the frozen trees. It was the kind of day that beckons something old inside him, the part that once believed in movement, in doing something useful. Grace followed him closely, as she often did, her gait strong now, her eyes scanning the trees ahead like a silent guardian. Hickory and Snow were curled up inside the cabin, having finally exhausted themselves from their morning burst of energy. Jack had only planned to gather a little firewood. The old stack behind the shed was running low, and though the worst of the blizzard seemed over, winter still gripped the mountain with sharp claws. He took his time walking, enjoying the sound of snow crunching beneath his boots, the way Grace's breath misted beside him. They stopped at a familiar, fallen tree, one Jack had used often as a chopping station. As he set down the axe and began to clear the powdery snow from the wood, his footing shifted, just a small patch of ice, hidden beneath a dusting of snow. But it was enough. His legs shot out, and he went down hard. Pain exploded through his ankle and shot up into his hip as he landed awkwardly. The axe skittered away. The impact knocked the wind from him, and he lay there for a moment, stunned, the cold leaching in quickly through his coat. When he tried to move, a sharp, white-hot pain in his right leg told him exactly what he didn't want to hear. Broken, not badly, maybe, but enough to keep him down. He reached for the axe, but it was just out of reach. His phone left back in the cabin. The air around him had changed. What had been a calm winter day now seemed too quiet, too still. Grace was beside him instantly, pressing her nose against his face, then sniffing frantically down his body, trying to understand why he wasn't rising. "It's all right, girl," he muttered, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "Just give me a minute." But it wasn't going to be just a minute. Every time he tried to sit up or crawl, the pain shot through him like fire. He could feel the throbbing starting already, the cold wrapping around his limbs. Grace paced, whining low in her throat, ears pinned back. She was watching him, waiting for a command, something familiar. Jack looked at her, then toward the cabin far in the distance, barely visible through the trees. "Go," he whispered. "Grace, go home." She tilted her head. He repeated it, louder this time. "Home. Grace, go." Still she hesitated, but then something shifted in her expression. She turned and bolted. Jack exhaled, leaned his head back against the snow, and let the cold swallow him a little more. Minutes passed, maybe more. He drifted in and out of thought, the pain dulling into something distant. He thought about Ember, about the burning building, about how he'd never had the chance to say goodbye. He thought about the quiet that came after her loss, the silence he had waited through for years. Then, distantly, faintly, the sound of a bell. Jack blinked. A bell again came on, louder this time. A metal clang echoing through the woods like a memory. The emergency bell. Years ago, after he'd retired and bought the cabin, he'd rigged a simple pulley system bell mounted above the door, with a rope tied to a wooden stake by the porch. It had been his old habit from the field. A last resort alert. He'd never used it, never imagined it might one day be used on him. But now, as he lay broken in the snow, that sound came again, sharp and clear and impossible. Grace had pulled the bell. She'd run the whole way back and triggered the alert. Jack laughed, a strangled, breathless sound lost in the trees. "Good girl," he whispered. "Good, brave girl." Not long after, he heard footsteps crunching snow. Then a voice. "Jack, Jack. Where the hell are you?" It was Kenton, his neighbor, the only other soul living within a mile radius. Jack tried to shout, but his throat was dry. His voice cracked. Grace barked from nearby, guiding Kenton to the spot like a trained rescue dog. And in truth, that's what she was. That's what she had always been. Kenton's face appeared above him, wide-eyed and stunned. "Jesus, Jack, what happened?" "Just slipped," Jack muttered. Grace rang the bell. "Yeah, I figured. Nearly gave me a heart attack." With Kenton's help and a sled pulled from his truck, they got Jack back to the cabin. Grace never left his side, not even when Kenton insisted she move so he could lift Jack more easily. She growled once, just low enough to show she wouldn't tolerate being pushed away. Back inside, wrapped in blankets and high on painkillers Kenton happened to have from his own bad knee days, Jack drifted in and out of sleep. Every time he woke, Grace was there, sitting, watching, just like Ember used to. The vet came the next day, confirmed a clean fracture. Nothing too severe, but Jack would need crutches for a while. Rest, care. Grace was his nurse. Snow and Hickory were his joy. And the cabin, for all its creaks and drafts, had never felt more like a home. That night, Jack opened the journal again. His handwriting was sloppy, but the words mattered. She didn't hesitate. She didn't run away. She saved me, just like Ember did all those years ago. But this time, I didn't lose her. This time, I get to say thank you. The firelight danced on the walls as the dog slept nearby. The bell outside swayed gently in the wind, its chime a soft, lingering note in the quiet night. Jack closed his eyes, listening to it, not as an alarm, not as a warning, but as a song that said you are not alone, not anymore. The snow began to melt in patches, quietly at first, as if unsure whether it was truly time to leave. The hard frost that had gripped the earth for months softened around the edges, revealing small patches of muddy ground and brittle grass underneath. Jack watched it happen from the front porch. A crutch propped under one arm, a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, and a chipped mug of coffee steaming in his hand. Grace lay beside him, her head resting on her front paws, eyes half closed but always alert. Snow darted in and out of the trees like a comet made of fur, barking at birds, at nothing, at everything. Hickory, now stronger, ventured just beyond the porch steps, each step careful but determined, his once limping leg now sturdy enough to carry him, albeit with a small but proud wobble. Jack breathed in the cold spring air and smiled to himself. It wasn't the warm kind of spring that comes all at once. No, it was the stubborn kind, the kind that had to fight its way through layers of ice and wind and memory. But it was coming, and that was enough. Inside the cabin, things had changed, though not in grand, obvious ways. The walls were still lined with the same shelves, the same old books, the same clock that ticked too loudly. But now there were new additions. A small box of dog toys under the window, scratches on the floor near the hearth where Snow liked to skid in excitement, a handmade ramp beside the porch steps to help Hickory until he felt confident enough to leap on his own. The scent of dog fur and wood smoke clung to everything, and Jack wouldn't have it any other way. He sat longer these days, not because of the healing leg, though that was part of it, but because he enjoyed the pause. He liked watching Grace's ears flick at distant sounds, liked seeing the light shift through the trees, liked the soft rise and fall of sleeping puppies beside the fire. The world had stopped being something he avoided. It had become something he observed again, with curiosity, with care. One morning, while organizing a cabinet he hadn't touched in years, Jack came across an old digital camera. The battery was somehow still good. Or maybe the universe had decided he had earned one small miracle. He dusted it off, walked outside, and snapped a photo. Grace in profile, her eyes catching the early sun, snow mid-leap, a blur of motion and joy. Hickory sitting proudly, chest puffed out, wobble forgotten. Jack printed the photo at the hardware store in town, where the clerk, a teenager with dyed green hair, grinned and said, "That's a pretty great-looking pack you've got there, mister." He smiled at that. On the back of the printed photo, he scribbled a line, just one. Some journeys end at your front door. Some begin when you choose to open it. He taped the picture on the wall beside the one of Ember, not to replace her, but to join her. A timeline, a continuation. He didn't hide Ember's photo anymore, didn't flinch when he saw her bright eyes or remembered the fire. She still lived in the pages of him, in the strength of his silence and the depth of his care. But now there was room for others too. One evening, the light slanted through the trees just right, and Jack felt something stir inside him, a desire to share. Not just with Grace and the pups, but with the world beyond the trees. He turned on his phone, logged into the old social media account he hadn't used in years, and posted the photo. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he typed a short caption. "I opened the door thinking I was saving them, but the truth is, they saved me from a loneliness I didn't know how to name." He didn't expect much, maybe a few likes, maybe nothing, but overnight, the post traveled farther than Jack could have imagined. Comments poured in, people from all over the country writing things like, "I needed this today," or "Thank you for opening the door," or simply, "This made me cry." Messages from others who had lost dogs, who had lost people, who had lost themselves. Some asked how Grace was doing. Some asked if Hickory could really walk now. Some just said thank you. Jack read every word. Some he answered. Some he printed out and tucked into a drawer. Not because he needed the praise, but because it reminded him connection wasn't a weakness. It was proof that we still care, that we still choose each other, even across distance and silence. Spring pressed on. The first blooms arrived, tiny yellow flowers poking through patches of thawing dirt. Snow chased butterflies instead of snowflakes. Hickory climbed the porch steps without help for the first time and promptly fell asleep in victory at the top. Grace, ever steady, took to sleeping outside in the early evenings, her nose twitching toward the wind, as if still guarding something sacred. Jack began writing again. Not long stories, not fiction, just small moments. A daily log of things he noticed. Hickory didn't fall one day. Snow stole a sandwich. Grace let a bird land beside her and didn't flinch. And then, one morning, he wrote this, "I think I'm ready to let people in again." A week later, Eleanor called, Grace's former owner. They hadn't spoken since the first call, though Jack had sent her an occasional update. This time, her voice was stronger, happier. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for Grace, for reminding me it's okay to love again." She had adopted a senior cat from the shelter, named her Hope. Jack smiled at the name. He hung up and told Grace, who wagged her tail and nudged his knee. That night, as dusk rolled in, soft and purple, Jack sat on the porch with all three dogs around him. He watched the stars blink into existence, slow and shy at first, then bold and bright. He looked at Grace, who sat still as stone, and whispered, "You've done enough now. You can rest." But she didn't move. She simply laid her head on his foot, and in that gesture, Jack understood she already had. The world hadn't become perfect. His legs still ached in the mornings. The roof still leaked in one corner. Hickory still stumbled on occasion. Snow still chewed through boots, but the silence that had once filled his days was no longer empty. It was full of breath, of life, of purpose. Spring didn't come all at once. It never does. But it came. And when it did, It brought with it a reminder that even after the longest winters, even after loss and silence and locked doors, there is something waiting, something small, something warm. Sometimes it has four legs and a limp. Sometimes it scratches at your door during a snowstorm. Sometimes it's you deciding to open that door. And sometimes, if you're lucky, what you let in is the very thing that lets you begin again. On Grace's new collar, engraved with care, were three words, not fancy, not poetic, but truer than anything Jack had ever written. Found, loved, home.